Sometimes, the most terrifying stories don't begin in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but inside the walls of a familiar home, where danger hides behind the face of someone who is supposed to protect you. And if you've ever ignored a gut feeling, brushed off a warning sign, or told yourself it's probably nothing, then Zaria's story will sit heavy on your heart because a 15-year-old girl sensed something wasn't right, begged not to go, tried everything she could to stay away from her father's house that weekend. And yet she walked into the one place she feared most. What happened next would shake an entire community, force investigators to confront a level of cruelty they compared to a horror film, and challenge all of us to reconsider how we listen to young people when they tell us they're scared. This isn't just a story about a crime, but about warning signs dismissed, hidden darkness, and a heartbreaking reminder that evil sometimes lives inside the people we least expect. And today, we're going to walk through a case that will leave you questioning how well we ever truly know someone, including the people closest to us. Before everything unraveled, Zaria's life looked like the kind of teenage world filled with movement, music, and possibility. She wasn't just another student blending into the hallways. She was the kind of girl whose energy filled the room long before she spoke. A dancer who practiced until her legs burned. A musician who loved the orchestra, not because it made her special, but because it made her feel alive. Teachers remembered her as the kid who volunteered for everything, who laughed loudly, who tried to cheer up classmates having a bad day. The kind of friend who would give you her last snack because she didn't want anyone to feel left out. And yet, even in bright lives like hers, shadows sometimes appear in places no one expects. Zaria didn't talk much about the uncomfortable feeling she got at her father's house, not because she wanted to protect him, but because she didn't want to worry anyone, especially her mother, who trusted that weekends with her dad were safe, predictable, routine. But teenagers often carry silent fears, small whispers they don't know how to turn into sentences adults will take seriously. So Zaria kept smiling, kept dancing, kept showing up for her friends, all while a quiet tension tugged at her every time that weekend approached. In those moments, you can almost imagine her thinking, maybe this time will be okay. Maybe I'm overreacting. Because that's what young people are taught to believe when their instincts clash with adult expectations. But instincts, especially a child's instincts, don't lie. They warn, they echo, they persist, and hers were practically screaming. As that fateful weekend approached, something in Zaria felt different, stronger, sharper, more urgent than the usual uneasiness she'd learned to swallow. She tried everything she could to stay away. She asked her mother if she could stay home, asked a friend if she could crash at their place, dropped subtle hints that she just didn't feel like going. But when you're 15, subtle doesn't always translate into danger for the adults around you. And it's easy, painfully easy, to imagine how her mother interpreted the moment. Just a teenager wanting weekend freedom, wanting to hang out, wanting to do anything except the routine visits she'd been doing for years. And for many families, that assumption would have been harmless, just another moment in the push and pull of adolescence. But here, that misunderstanding became the single moment her mother would replay for the rest of her life. Imagine the weight of that, the guilt of thinking it was just stubbornness when it was fear, real fear. And what's even more devastating is that Zaria understood she didn't have another option. So she gathered her things, maybe told herself she should stop worrying, maybe told herself she was being dramatic, and stepped into a situation she had desperately tried to escape. It's moments like these that remind us how often danger doesn't look like danger until it's too late. How silence from a scared teenager can be misread as normal teenage moodiness, and how small choices, ones that seem harmless in the moment, can become irreversible fault lines in a family story. Had one friend's plans changed? Had one adult paused long enough to ask, "Why don't you want to go?" Had one small thing gone differently? The entire trajectory of that weekend might have shifted, but instead Zaria walked into a place where her instincts had been trying to save her. On the surface, Joshua Burgess played the role of the devoted father with unsettling ease, posting photos where he smiled next to his daughter, calling her his mini-me, and curating a version of himself that looked stable, present, even loving to anyone scrolling past his page. But the truth is that social media is the easiest place in the world to hide in plain sight. And the digital version of Joshua was nothing more than a carefully painted mask. Behind closed doors, his anger simmered, unpredictable and sharp enough that Zaria's friends noticed, even if adults didn't. Some of them whispered about the way his temper flared without warning. Others mentioned that he sometimes looked strung out, spaced out, like someone whose thoughts didn't quite connect to the world around him. But because no official reports existed, no history of documented abuse, no neighbor calling the police, everything looked normal on paper. And that's exactly how danger thrives quietly, invisibly, wrapped in the lie that if something were wrong, someone would have noticed. And perhaps the most chilling part is how ordinary he appeared. Just another parent navigating shared custody. Another man who blended into the crowd with no visible signs of the darkness he carried. We often expect monsters to look like monsters. But Joshua didn't have glowing eyes or snarling teeth. He had a friendly smile, a Facebook profile, and a daughter who trusted him enough to keep visiting even when something inside her whispered not to. The gap between who he pretended to be and who he truly was would soon shatter into the open, revealing a darkness so calculated and so cold-blooded that even veteran investigators struggled to process the reality they walked into. The morning Joshua walked into the police station, there was no chaos, no chase, no frantic attempt to cover his tracks. Instead, he entered with the chilling calm of someone returning a library book, approached the front desk, and matter-of-factly announced that he had taken a life. A statement so casual, the officer initially thought he was joking or confused, because people don't confess to unthinkable crimes in that tone unless something inside them has been broken for a very long time. But Joshua wasn't confused, and when he clarified that the victim was his own daughter, everything in the room shifted. The air, the posture of the officers, the sense of reality. Detectives quickly pulled him into an interrogation room, expecting distress, remorse, panic, anything human, but instead they encountered a man who spoke with an eerie stillness, detailing the location of his daughter's body and walking them, step by step, through a series of actions so disturbing that seasoned investigators later described the scene as something from a horror movie. And while police raced to the address he provided, there must have been a moment of quiet. Devastating moment when they still hoped he was lying, exaggerating, or suffering from some kind of psychotic break. Because no one wants to believe that a father could intentionally orchestrate hours of torment against his own child. But the scene they discovered erased any hope of misunderstanding, revealing a level of violence that left even hardened detectives shaken. The kind of crime that echoes in your mind long after you've left the room. And when his confession matched every detail, every timeline, every injury, officers realized they were dealing not with a man who snapped in a moment of rage, but with someone who had planned, rehearsed, and executed a series of acts no human heart should be capable of. When investigators stepped into the house Joshua had pointed them to, they weren't prepared for what they would find. Because even in a profession where tragedy becomes routine, there are certain scenes that leave a permanent scar on the people who walk into them. The home itself looked abandoned from the outside, quiet, neglected, almost forgotten by the neighborhood. But inside, officers discovered evidence of hours-long torment, brutality that pushed the boundary of what anyone could imagine a parent inflicting on their own child. And in the middle of that silence, they found Zaria, a young girl whose life had been full of music and movement. now reduced to a crime scene because the one person responsible for protecting her chose destruction instead. The details investigators later revealed were so disturbing the sheriff himself struggled for words, calling it one of the most cold-blooded acts he had ever encountered. And if you've ever wondered how something like this can happen without anyone noticing, the uncomfortable truth is that danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it wears the face of a parent. And by the time the truth surfaces, the damage is irreversible. Neighbors would later say they didn't even know anyone lived there. A chilling reminder of how isolation can become a breeding ground for cruelty. How people can hide terrible secrets simply by keeping their world small, quiet, and disconnected from others. And whether Joshua's violence stemmed from deep-seated psychological issues, a growing obsession with control, or a hidden darkness he had cultivated for years, the result was the same: a child who trusted the wrong person. A crime that made veteran investigators step outside for air, and a community forced to confront the reality that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. They sometimes live in houses we pass without a second glance. When the case finally made its way into the courtroom in 2022, nearly 3 years after the crime, there was a quiet tension that hung in the air, the kind that comes when everyone already knows the outcome but must still sit through the long, painful process of reliving what happened. Joshua had confessed fully, in detail, so one might expect a guilty plea, an acceptance of responsibility, maybe even a moment of remorse, but instead he pleaded not guilty, as though distancing himself from the very horror he calmly described to detectives. His legal team attempted to block the recorded confession from being played, arguing technicalities, procedural nuances, anything that might soften the crushing weight of evidence. But the judge denied those efforts, and the jury heard everything. And multiple witnesses later said that what struck them most was his emotional emptiness. Not one tear, not one crack in his voice, not a single expression of regret, just a cold, steady tone that left even strangers unnerved. Throughout the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man driven by control, someone who feared losing influence over his daughter as she grew older, someone whose obsession twisted into violence when he felt that grip slipping. And perhaps the most haunting detail revealed in court was the suggestion that Joshua had planned not just the crime, but the entire weekend breakfast with his daughter. Normal interactions, and then the gradual descent into cruelty, as though he were following a script only he understood. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury's unanimous decision sentenced him to death, along with an additional 76 years for the other charges. A punishment reflecting both the severity of the crime and the complete absence of humanity displayed by the man responsible. For the community watching, it wasn't a moment of triumph, but a somber acknowledgement that some acts are so dark, so calculated, that justice can only attempt to balance the scales, but never actually restore what was taken. Long after the verdict was read, people still searched for explanations, because when a crime feels this senseless, the human mind refuses to sit quietly with there is no reason. Online communities, amateur investigators, and even those who had once known Joshua began combing through his digital footprint, looking for clues to understand how an ordinary father could commit an act that defied humanity. What they found wasn't a confession of future violence, but unsettling fragments posts laced with racial hostility, photographs of weapons he joked about loving to cut with, interactions with extremist pages, and signals of an internal world far darker than anything he showed to the outside. And while none of this amounted to official evidence of organized affiliations or ritualistic motives, the patterns raised uncomfortable questions. Was this cruelty brewing for years beneath the surface? Had he fantasized about violence long before he acted on it? How many red flags get dismissed because someone seems normal enough? And the truth is that sometimes the darkness inside a person doesn't erupt in one dramatic moment. It grows slowly, quietly, fed by isolation, resentment, obsession, or beliefs they never speak aloud. Yet amid the speculation, one fact remained painfully clear. There had been no documented history of abuse, no police calls, no warning in his official record. Nothing that would have signaled to the system that Zaria was in danger. Her fear lived in the emotional spaces adults often overlook: comments to friends, subtle discomfort, a teenager's sense that something was wrong. And perhaps the hardest part to accept is that even if the world searches forever, there may never be a satisfying explanation for why Joshua did what he did, because some acts of cruelty grow from a distorted, twisted need for control that logic can't unravel. In the end, the online theories, the disturbing posts, the whispered rumors all point toward a single truth: outward appearances are not protection. And sometimes the warning signs exist only in the instincts of the one person who isn't believed in time. In the days after the truth came out, the community didn't just grieve, they reeled. Because tragedies involving strangers are heartbreaking. But tragedies involving a child harmed by their own parent leave a unique kind of fracture. A wound that spreads outward through schools, churches, and neighborhoods like a shockwave. Zaria's friends struggled to reconcile the girl they loved bright, funny, always dancing, with the horrific reality of how her life ended. And teachers who once saw her twirling across the gym now found themselves lighting candles in silence, wondering if they had missed signs or if there was something they could have done. At her funeral, classmates gathered with bouquets, handwritten notes, and tear-stained programs. And the orchestra she had once performed with dedicated a piece to her honor, the melody trembling in the air like a goodbye they never imagined saying. And for her mother, the grief was beyond words, the kind of loss that collapses a universe. Because no parent prepares for this. No parent imagines sending their child off for a weekend visit and never getting the chance to hug them again. The community rallied around her, offering food, prayers, and presents. But grief of this magnitude is solitary, an ocean no one else can swim for you. Memorials popped up across town: stuffed animals at school gates, flowers on church steps, messages written on poster boards saying things like, "We love you, Zaria, and your light lives on." And while those gestures couldn't undo the tragedy, they formed a collective promise that she would not be erased by the cruelty of one man's actions. And slowly, the community began to confront broader questions. What does it mean to trust your instincts? How do we better protect the unspoken fears of teenagers? How do we create spaces where young people feel safe telling adults what scares them? Because behind every memorial, every candle, every whispered prayer was a shared realization that listening, truly listening, can be the difference between life and loss. When all the courtroom doors closed, when the news vans disappeared, and when the community tried to piece itself back together, one devastating truth remained. Zaria's story is not only about a crime, it's about a warning system that failed her. Her instincts were loud, but the world around her was louder with assumptions, routine, and the belief that everything is probably fine. Because adults often misinterpret a teenager's fear as attitude, exaggeration, or mood swings, and that misinterpretation can be deadly. The greatest tragedy here isn't just what Joshua did, it's that Zaria tried to speak in the only way she knew how, asking to stay home, seeking a sleepover, explaining her discomfort to friends. And yet none of those signals connected to the kind of intervention that could have saved her. Not because anyone didn't care, but because society has never been taught to treat the emotional intuition of a young person as urgent, serious, or potentially life-saving. And Zaria's case challenges all of us parents, teachers, friends, neighbors to rethink how we respond when a child says, "I don't want to go," or "I don't feel safe," even if they can't explain why. The lesson here isn't about placing blame on those who loved her. It's about understanding that danger doesn't always arrive with flashing signs or bruises or broken windows. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in a smile, hiding behind a familiar face, waiting for the moment no one sees coming. And if telling this story does anything, let it reinforce one simple, powerful truth. When a child expresses fear, hesitation, or discomfort, you don't need proof to intervene. You need compassion, attention, and the willingness to ask the hard question. What's making you feel this way? Because listening early can save a life, silence cannot. Zaria deserved to grow up, to chase her dreams, to continue filling rooms with the sound of her laughter. And though we cannot change what happened to her, we can honor her by refusing to overlook the quiet warnings of the next child who tries to speak with more emotion than words. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder that instinct is a language, and we must learn to hear it. Zaria's story teaches us that children often sense danger long before adults recognize it. And when a young person expresses fear, even in subtle, imperfect ways, we owe them our full attention. By listening without judgment, questioning without dismissing, and protecting without hesitation, we can be the safeguard they need in moments they cannot navigate alone. Our life reminds us to trust instincts, pay attention to small signs, and never assume discomfort is just teenage behavior, because taking a child seriously might be the very thing that saves their life.